Red Steel released in North America on November 19th, 2006. One of 9 exclusive launch titles for the Nintendo Wii, published and developed by Ubisoft, one of the most prominent publishers and developers in the industry. Developed specifically by their Paris-based team, which is one of Ubisoft's oldest and largest development teams, who had previously worked on the Rayman and Splinter Cell franchises. In my Excite Truck review, I went on this long spiel about forgotten mediocre launch titles. Games that get a lot of attention solely because as launch titles, they are one of the only games available for the system that turn out to be unimpressive and uninteresting and are promptly forgotten as soon as better games become available for the system. Well, once again, I have been a dumb, stupid idiot, because that does not describe Excite Truck. Excite Truck didn't really get that much attention before release. Somewhat ironically, no one was very excited about Excite Truck, which is too bad because it was really fun. There was, however, one launch title for the Nintendo Wii that got a humongous amount of attention, that was being shown alongside the Wii at every big demonstration, that was overhyped to the moon and then back again. A game that was promising to change how gamers interacted with their video games forever, and that was Red Steel.
Master.
Yes, navigating dog?
Am I ready?
Concentrate. Attack! Are you trying to tickle him? Your ancestors are weeping. Fight, sissy! Enough. Get the gun. Red Steel for Wii. Rated T for teen. You suck.
Red Steel was the Wii's biggest third-party launch title, which was a big deal because Nintendo had a history of struggling to maintain third-party support on their home consoles. In the previous generation, there were a lot of games that released for the PS2 and Xbox that sort of inexplicably were never released for the equally technologically capable GameCube. That Ubisoft, a major third-party developer, was pushing so hard for the Nintendo Wii right out the gate seemed to be an indication that things might be different for Nintendo's new console, that perhaps the Wii would have the kind of third-party backing that the GameCube never did. The future would disappoint Nintendo fans though, as the Nintendo Wii ended up receiving far less third-party support than even the GameCube did, a result of the Wii's weaker hardware and weird controls. But we Nintendo fans didn't know that back on Wii launch day in November 2006, and Red Steel seemed a promising harbinger of what was to come. Furthermore, Ubisoft was buying really hard into the Nintendo Wii's promise of motion controls with Red Steel. This game was going to change the way you played video games. It was going to immerse you in the world of the video game in ways you had never experienced. It was making promises we wouldn't hear again until the release of virtual reality a decade later. Look at this man. He is actually eating sushi in real life while his character is at a sushi restaurant in the game. This game has blended the borders of this man's reality. The game is so immersive that it has warped his doo-doo brain. He no longer knows what is a game and what is real life. The immersiveness of Red Steel has caused this man to actually descend into raving lunatic madness. Honey, please come to bed.
I can't. I'm eating sushi in the game, so I must eat sushi in real life too.
Furthermore, Red Steel was going to prove that motion controls could be used to make real games for real gamers. Sure, Wii Sports proved that motion controls could be used for games your grandmother played, but Red Steel was going to prove that motion controls could improve hardcore games for serious gamers. And it was going to be awesome, and you were going to feel cool while you played. You were going to feel like you were actually holding a gun. and you could twist your pistol to the side like a gangster for some reason.
Controller, you can handle the gun the way you want, and at the first time, simply by moving your hand, like in real life. So, if you want to play it gangster style, you can.
And when you got into a sword fight, you would pull your controller out like a sword and engage in honorable one-on-one bladed combat like a samurai. And oh no, it kind of sucks. Red Steel was a massive disappointment and embarrassment for everyone involved. Everything from the shooting to the story to the sword fighting to the motion controls was a buggy, broken, rushed, underdeveloped joke. And the punchline was you for wasting your money on this garbage. Now, I didn't play this game until now, specifically for this review, and I'll admit I was actually surprised by how much I enjoyed it, considering its horrible reputation. That's not to say it's a good game, because it's not, but it's not a terrible game either. It's just sort of mediocre and forgettable. But let's start with what Red Steel did right. First, we've got to talk about the Wii Remote's infrared pointer. In previous reviews, I've spoken about how much I enjoyed motion controls, but I think the Wii Remote's real innovation and the thing that I've always been most disappointed wasn't carried over into future console control schemes was this infrared pointer. Admittedly, this really wasn't a new technology. Every light gun game at every arcade on the planet has been using pointer controls for shooters since like caveman times.
Come on in. It's almost another world here in the video arcades of America. In fact, that psychologists are beginning to worry that some youths are becoming spaced out on the space games. Many cities have reacted by making the arcades off limits to all under 17 from 8 to 3. Long hours at the screens, psychologists say, can lead to extreme introversion. Extreme introversion. Extreme introversion.
But the Wii Remote brought that technology into the bedroom and allowed it to be used for more than just cheap arcade shooters, and it works so gosh darn well. I will state it definitively. The pointer controls are vastly superior to dual stick for aiming. Dual stick for shooters is so much slower and stiffer and clumsier than the Wii Remote's pointer controls. Pointer controls are so much faster, more fluid, and simpler that I am to this day baffled that this is not the standard way to control shooters on consoles. The entire industry failed to adopt this simple and superior control scheme for their games, and it is a bummer to me. Red Steel was the first Wii exclusive to use the pointer controls extensively in a shooting game, and it works. I have no complaints about the aiming controls in this game. Developers would quickly discover that using a smaller so-called dead zone for turning the camera was superior. A dead zone in this context is the space on the screen in which the screen will not turn so long as your cursor is inside that space. In Red Steel, nearly the entire screen is a dead zone. So you have to point the controller at the very edge of the screen to turn your character, which is pretty slow. Later games on the Wii had much smaller dead zones, allowing players to turn the camera faster while keeping the cursor closer to the center of the screen, which feels much better and faster. But I'm willing to give Red Steel's developers some grace for being first, because it's not an obvious problem at all until you've actually experienced it for yourself. Also, as silly as tilting your gun to the side looks, it is kind of fun. I think Red Steel is a breed of first-person shooter that doesn't exist anymore. Firstly, because it is a single-player focused game, and single-player first-person shooters truly just don't exist anymore. And if you prefer single-player because you're like me, and you despise interacting with other human beings because everyone except for me is stupid and sucks, then you're just out of luck. But there's more to it than that. Red Steel is a slower-paced game than most recent first-person shooters, and I'm referring to the act of aiming and firing a gun in the game itself. There's a seemingly common sentiment I run into online in discussions of older first-person shooter games. Someone will say something like, I think Half-Life 2 is really cool, but the shooting feels so dated now. Or, I love BioShock, but its gunplay feels so outdated. And I do know what they're talking about. The shooting in Half-Life 2 and BioShock does feel a lot slower and stiffer than in newer games. And it's not just the pacing of the whole game, it's the actual aiming and shooting of the gun that is slower. A more recent example of that kind of slower shooting, I think, would be Arcane's Prey. Compare the shooting in that game to something like, say, Destiny. There is a difference in feel here. I think maybe it was the Call of Duty franchise to blame for this, that warped how shooter games control and how gamers expect gunplay to feel in their games. The shooting in Call of Duty was so buttery and fast, focused on quick-scoping and who can shoot the fastest, in a way that Half-Life 2 and BioShock and Prey are not. And I always hated it. I thought the shooting in Call of Duty felt slippery and limp and weak. And I always preferred the slower, heavier, weightier shooting of games like Half-Life and BioShock. Red Steel very much plays like those older style of shooters. The gun functions a bit stiffly and slowly. You have to be kind of methodical in your aiming, and I like it a lot. Playing it, I realized how much I miss this style of gunplay in video games. Red Steel also looks much better than I thought it would. Now, obviously, compared to any game released today, Red Steel looks like a big balled-up turd. And even compared to PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 games of the time, it looks pretty rough. And I recognize that, but the game's focus on aesthetic over realism really lifts the visuals up in places. Red Steel has a stylized Japanese aesthetic that is colorful and visually interesting. I was expecting this to be another brown-gray shooter full of industrial yards and bombed-out battlefields, but there's actually some creativity here, even craft and, dare I say it, artistry. There's a lot more variety here than I expected. Also, you're battling in expensive high-rise apartments and a Japanese bathhouse and a weird carnival funhouse thing and a techno club and a boat. Look at this boat. Red Steel is at its best when it's being campy and silly. When you're going down a street full of ramen shops and a bunch of ramen shop owners pull out machine guns and start trying to murder you, or you're fighting through a bathhouse where all of the enemies are wearing nothing but towels wrapped around their waists. And did they bring all their shotguns with them for their relaxing afternoon in the bathhouse? Or were they lying in wait for your character so long at the bathhouse that they were like, hey, let's take off all our clothes and do a round in the sauna while we wait. Oh no, here he comes and I don't have any time to put my pants on. Oh, what a conundrum.
Hey, man. When they told me I'd see some action in this place, I thought they just meant with the girls.
Or there's this time when a gangster comes at you with a baseball bat and your character pulls out his samurai sword and duels him. And a particular highlight for me was this goofy, over-the-top, creepy funhouse that came out of nowhere and I wasn't expecting at all and doesn't fit into the rest of the game in any way. It's completely ridiculous and weird and even kind of scary at times, and I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, Red Steel is not often at its best, and there's a lot more bad here than good. Firstly, the motion controls. They're bad. Red Steel way overuses the motion controls. You have to shake the nunchuck to pick up weapons and open doors. You have to shove the Wii Remote backwards and forwards to zoom in, which is so imprecise and awkward that I just never zoomed in with any of my weapons ever. Which is kind of a huge problem in a game where all you're doing is shooting at things. This is an example where you take a mediocre game, shove motion controls in where they don't belong, and make the game even worse. And then there's the sword fighting. Oh goodness, the sword fighting. So deeply disappointing. Pretty frequently, everything in this game just completely halts. So you can have these slow, clumsy, awkward one-on-one sword fights. And it is so irritating to me that I'm not allowed to just shoot these sword-wielding morons in the face. like Indiana Jones taking down that one show-off doofus loser that one time. That is realistically how every sword fight in this game should go. I'll say up front, even if the motion controls worked, which they don't, these sword fights would suck because they are so slow. Every sword enemy has the exact same 2 moves, a fast move and a slow move, and you react to them in the exact same way every single time. You dodge or you parry every time, and the enemies have so much health. You have to whap these idiots in the face like 40 times with your supposedly legendary samurai blade. 40 hits every single time before they go down. What is my sword made out of? Freaking peanut butter? And the motion controls don't work. Every 1 in 5 moves you make with the motion controls just outright don't register. So you'll get an opening in the fight, swing your controller, and then your character just stands there like a buffoon, like a nearsighted toad who left his glasses at home that day and is trying to figure out if the blurry oncoming object is from the Toad World version of Publishers Clearinghouse coming to hand him an oversized check, or is it this butthole who's gonna whap me in the face 3 times, again with his own peanut butter sword. Combos don't work. Special moves do not work. The parrying barely works. You have to swing your arm so freaking hard to get this game to register your swings that I almost accidentally bludgeoned my cat to death, who was sitting beside me while I played. I will say, sometimes you get into a rhythm where the controls are working and you're parrying and you're swiping with the sword, and it really does feel good. It actually is kind of fun, but those moments are so rare. The sword fighting feels both paradoxically over-ambitious and also cheap and underdeveloped. It's cheap because there's so little variety in your enemies or moveset. It is the exact same fight 100 times in a row. But it's also over-ambitious because it's demanding a precision and speed from the Wii Remote that the controller just isn't capable of. Beyond the swordplay, the gunplay is let down by a lot of small problems that add up to a big stinky turd. Like how the enemies never react to your shots in any way, so it always feels like you're shooting pellets or butterfly wings or grandma's kisses at them instead of bullets. Your character has too little health, and that health bar just melts in the face of multiple enemies. So you have to constantly run away and wait for your health to return, which doesn't feel fun at all. And I would insert my rant here about how automatically restoring health is a terrible game mechanic because it rewards players for sitting still and hiding and not actually playing the game, instead of a health pack mechanic which rewards players for going out and pushing forward, playing the game. But this review is already really long, and I need to talk about this game's story. Red Steel's story is told entirely through these still images that are so cheap looking and blurry and ugly. Watching them is like watching a movie with a transparent bag of actual poop held up in front of your face to watch it through. How did this game ship with still images this blurry and ugly? The story is mostly forgettable and uninteresting and also confusing. So your Japanese fiance gets kidnapped by the Yakuza, and you've got to rescue her. Or she got kidnapped by the bad Yakuza because you're helping the Yakuza, except maybe they're bad because they murdered the villain's father. But also maybe the villain's father was a piece of crap and deserved it, except no one ever says anything he actually did wrong. And also maybe everyone is bad because they're literal mobsters running a criminal empire, so I don't know. The story does become laughably and head-scratchingly bad at a couple spots, where the villain, who again kidnapped your fiance, fiance whines at you and asks you why you won't just leave him alone. This happens on multiple occasions, where he's like, just leave me alone, go away, let me revenge my father's murder, why do you even care? But he kidnapped your fiance. In this scene, he is asking your character, why do you keep chasing me? When he literally has a samurai sword pointed at your fiance's throat. Like, dude, that is why I'm chasing you. Does this villain have brain damage? Did whoever wrote this forget their brain at home that day? It's just dumb. I mean, come on. The game also has a multiplayer mode, which might very well be fun. But I couldn't test it because I don't have any friends. There is something charming about Red Steel's use of motion controls. For all its flaws, and there are a lot of flaws, Red Steel feels like it was developed during a kind of Wild West period of the Wii's motion controls, where developers hadn't figured out yet what the Wii Remote could and couldn't do. And so potentially anything goes, anything might work, we didn't know yet. I really appreciate that the developers were experimenting and trying new things and exploring the limits of what this new control scheme was capable of. It is unfortunate that they discovered more ways that motion controls don't work than ways that do work, but I appreciate the effort, especially now that we're in an era of video games where control schemes have completely stagnated and no one ever tries to do anything new as far as actual controls go. The developers deserve some leeway for working in the, hey, we're still a long way from figuring this out phase of motion control development. Red Steel's most important legacy, though, is that it laid the foundations for Red Steel 2, the stunning follow-up, possibly the most improved sequel of all time, and maybe the greatest motion control game ever developed. But Red Steel 2 doesn't release until 2010, and I'm still stuck all the way back in 2006, working through the Nintendo Wii's launch titles. And it'll be a long time before the joyous day comes when I get to review Red Steel 2.